Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Angela Rayner's story is a pretty remarkable one. She left school at 16 with few qualifications and little knowledge of politics. She only came into the House of Commons 2 years ago in 2015, but she has risen like a rocket and is now in charge of Labour's education policy herself. The Shadow Education Secretary joins me now. Thanks for coming in, Angela Rayner. Can I ask you, first of all, about access to education? Is it true that fewer working-class kids are getting into university education as a result of the tuition fees
Well,
policy?
you know, Andrew, I don't believe that that's the case, actually, but I do believe that many working-class and part-time and older, mature students are actually leaving university. And there's three things that the coalition government helped with the Conservatives that they've done that have led to the disastrous situation that we're in today. Of course, you mentioned the hike in tuition fees, but there was the removal of the maintenance grants, there was the increase in the percentage of the loans. They changed it so they couldn't use the base rate of the Bank of England, and they upped the amount of percentage that people paid that I believe actually directly impacted. And of course the thresholds of income, which has made that more students will pay back more from the beginning as well.
All of those things may be true, but nevertheless the Labour policy is predicated on something that Jeremy Corbyn said. He said fewer working class young people are applying to university. That is not true, is it?
Well, what's happening actually is more working class people are coming out of university and they're leaving with considerable amount of debts.
Many more are going in. Many more are
so
going.
5 times more are actually coming out of university and not being able to finish their degrees. And I think that's as a direct impact of some of the government changes, like I say, on maintenance grants.
I want to come on to all of that, but again, one more time, very straightforwardly, is it true that fewer working class young people are applying to university?
Well, what's fantastic, and I think it's because of the last...
It's not true, is it?
The last Labour government did a huge amount to encourage aspirations to get more working class people into universities. And of course, we've got record levels of people applying for universities.
Listen, we have one small problem here, which is I'm reading you out something that Jeremy Corbyn said, which isn't true. And I'm asking you if it's true, and you're giving me answers to other things.
Well, no, I'm clarifying that I believe more students are going into university.
So they are, so that's
but there's record levels of students that are actually having to leave university before they've finished their qualifications. And I think that's because of the government's policies. They've done away with maintenance grants. They've increased the percentage rates of loans, which you've talked about earlier in the programme, and they've lowered the threshold for income so that people are paying more early on.
Because it's not a marginal point at all. 73% more people from working class backgrounds have gone to university since the tuition fees policy was introduced. It's gone up enormously.
And the amount of people that are actually having to leave university before they've even got the qualifications has gone up enormously as well. And part-time students and mature students as well. Over 50% are having to leave their college courses, their university courses, before they've completed them. And that, I think, is directly as a result of the current policies of this government.
I'm not defending the current policy. I'm just suggesting that, for instance, 22% of children who are eligible for free school meals now go to university. Before this policy, it was 3% or 4%. It's a huge increase. And yes, some people fall out of the other end and get into financial trouble, but many, many more people are going in the first place.
Well, it's great that many are going. And actually, one of the things that's happening as well, Andrew, is many people are leaving university and unfortunately are having to go to jobs where they're not able to utilise their degrees as well. And I think that's a real scandal. And that's why we've had a policy of looking at FE as well in the further education, colleges and technical education, because I think it's about lifelong learning for everybody, not just about that particular area.
So my point to you is you're spending at the moment, as a party, you want to spend about £11 billion ending this tuition fee policy. Much of that money will go to relatively affluent middle class and upper middle class families and children. Would it not be better to spend that kind of money on getting rid of, replacing some of the tax breaks that have been taken away by the Tories for working class, the children's tax breaks and so forth, and spending it at the bottom end of society? Because the Fabian Society say you would actually make poorer families worse off compared to better off families.
Well, it's £9.5 billion, the amount that will take for the student loans company to reverse the tuition fees.
Plus the maintenance grants.
And then, of course, the maintenance grants, which are for the most disadvantaged of students. And I think that's really progressive. But I make no apologies for actually a huge amount of our manifesto was about our National Education Service. And we talked about early years, we talked about Sure Start centres, which was the last Labour government that introduced them. We've lost a tremendous amount of our early years centres under the Coalition and the Conservatives. So we talked about a whole package package arranged from the early years, cradle till grave, a national education service, which was about making sure that everyone has access to education. Because we know, Andrew, that that's how you make social progression.
Absolutely
that's how
right.
you ensure
Absolutely
that people can
right.
get on in life.
But right at the end of the campaign, I think 7 days before polling, Jeremy Corbyn said that he wanted to think about wiping out the current student debt, which is a vast amount of money.
It is.
And he said that you are now going to be working on that policy. Now, that's not funded at the moment. Have you been working on that policy? Do you have any numbers about how much that's going to cost?
Well, Andrew, it's a big abacus that I'm working on with that. It is a huge amount. It's 100 billion, which they estimate currently, which will increase. It's a huge amount of money. But, of course, we also know that a third of that is never repaid. You know, it's a treasury trick.
Were you surprised to be handed that abacus right at the last minute?
Well, I like a challenge, Andrew, but, you know, we've got to start dealing with this debt crisis that we're foisting on our young people. It's not acceptable. They're leaving university with £57,000 worth of debt. It's completely unsustainable, and we've got to start tackling that. There's three things I call on the government to do that they can do immediately. They can reverse the maintenance grants, abolishing that. That will help the most disadvantaged students. They could stop and reduce the percentage rate that students have to pay on their loans, and they can ensure that the amount that they repay, the income threshold, goes up in line with average earnings. There are three things that the Conservatives can do before September that will help students out.
Aren't you just simply spraying around huge spending promises too recklessly? I mean, another £100 billion on tuition fees right at the last minute. That's some Sophy you have to find.
Well, like you said, Jeremy said that that's an ambition. It's something that he'd like to do. It's something that we will not announce that we're doing unless we can afford to do that.
All right, can I turn to recent events? You're at the Durham Miners Gala. There's a picture of you with Jeremy Corbyn there, I think, doing a selfie from thing. And they were chanting your name, and you are now a big part of the current Labour leadership group. Can I ask you what you feel about the fact that so many of your colleagues were disinvited to that event? They were told they hadn't been supportive enough of Jeremy Corbyn and they were not going to be given hospitality by the Durham Miners.
Well, I don't like anything in the Labour family that disenfranchises any part of our movement because, of course, we are a big movement and we're all the better for it. And, you know, at the moment, we should be concentrating on making sure we're ready for a next general election because that manifesto, Andrew, I believe was the best manifesto Labour had done since the 1945 Labour manifesto, and I think it offers hope. And if we're divided and we're fighting each other, we're not going to be able to implement that.
Because I noticed after the Luciana Berger row, one thing that was very obvious, not much was obvious about it, one thing was obvious was the almost complete silence from colleagues coming out to speak in her support. Can you say something in her support? Because you're not sounding like a terribly comradely party at the moment.
Oh, no, we are. And, you know, Luciana, I worked with Luciana on Campaign for Mental Health because, I personally have been affected by that with my mum since I was about the age of 10. So I know how it affects families. And Luciana has done a tremendous amount of work. She's an absolute valued member of the team. And, anyone that talks of deselecting any of my colleagues, quite frankly, they need to think about actually who are the real enemy here, who are making the problems for our communities at the moment, who have made those disastrous policies that are hurting the people that need us the most, and it doesn't help them if we're fighting each other.
Don't talk about deselection. And what about those people who say we're actually too broad a church in the Labour Party, we ought to be a narrower church?
I love the church that I'm in the Labour Party, Andrew. It's my religion. I've been born and raised in the Labour movement and I'll continue to be happy that it's as vibrant and as democratic as it is.
Angela Rayner, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, another week and there's more pressure building on the government to loosen the belt on its spending plans. And one of the biggest pressure points is schools, where Theresa May faces growing protests over funding changes and the cap on teachers' pay. I've been out on the road to try and hear what those on the front line are saying.
The Urswick School in Hackney, East London, is on the up. Founded in 1520 to educate the poor, after a checkered past, results are improving and pupils are disciplined. But there is real fear here about changes to the funding formula, designed to redistribute money more fairly between inner-city schools and those in parts of England that have historically received less. The government has promised that no school will lose cash, but head teacher Richard Brown is worried about a race to the bottom, and the uncertainty around Theresa May's fragile new government isn't helping either.
I don't know my budget for the next financial year, which will start next April. I could be looking at a 3% cut. I could be looking at a budget that is similar to what I've got now. I can't do any long-term financial planning while there is this continual uncertainty that stems from government.
So just to be clear, if your funding's cut, that means you'll have to get rid of teachers?
If our funding is going to be cut year on year for the next 3 years, which is something that was suggested, 3% a year for 3 years, there is only one way of then living within that cut, and that is by making teaching staff redundant. Now, we have a dedicated set of teachers here, experienced teachers who meet the needs of the children, and yet I might have to be in a position of deciding if any of those need to go. That is not where I want to be, it's not where parents want me to be, and it shouldn't be what government wants either.
And how many teachers are you talking about?
Worst case scenario, if we were facing 3% cuts for the next 3 years, which is something that was proposed at one point, that could be anything up to 25 teaching posts. That would be a catastrophic situation for us to be in. And equally, it's not just this school. Every school in Hackney and every school in inner London is facing exactly the same situation.
Do you think politicians really understand the pressures that schools are under?
No, I think that they imagine that there's some sort of fat and that we can trim the fat and then we can still deliver what we're delivering now. That is not what we can do. We have already reduced the number of support staff in the school. We're spending less money on music tuition next year. So far, we have avoided any staff redundancies. We've used natural wastage. Other schools in the area have already made teachers redundant. This is a real issue for schools that politicians do need to address urgently.
Pay is another contentious issue. Since 2010, public sector pay rises have been frozen or capped at 1%. Teachers here worry it's putting people off the profession.
Being newly married, it's a strain, you know, to buy a property, and that's something that I want to be able to do in the future. But it, you know, with cuts, you know, to my pay, there's only so much I can do. So currently I am renting, but I'm hoping that in the future that's something that can obviously change, so I can buy my own property and be a homeowner.
And could it be putting off other teachers entering the profession?
Yes, definitely. During my teacher training, I was studying to be a teacher with many passionate individuals who are currently now leaving the profession because of the pay cuts.
We love the profession, so we're here. But I think new people going through university, thinking about doing PGCEs, they're probably put off because they're thinking, am I going to be able to afford to live?
Now things are getting political, with parents producing slick campaign material and even roping in the kids too. This particular sing-along was produced by Fair Funding for All Schools, who will march on Westminster next weekend calling for increased investment in education.
Parents are very concerned but also very unhappy because we've been lied to. The last government said that education spending was protected, but it wasn't. And this means that parents are deeply unhappy that their children will be impacted by these cuts when they needn't be. We should be investing in our schools.
After losing her majority, Theresa May is vulnerable and MPs have scented blood. She's already ditched plans to scrap free school meals for primary schools. Now politicians from all parties are calling for an end to the public sector pay cap. The problem is, all this costs money.
How much you can do about public sector pay is about as long as a piece of string. Each 1% you add to the public sector pay bill costs you more than £1.5 billion. So each little bit costs quite a lot. So if you want to do a lot, then it's going to cost you a really significant amount.
I'm keen to talk a bit more widely about austerity as well, because it seems like it's become a bit of a dirty word recently, is it?
If you look at social care, you look at the health service, you look at what's happening in prisons, to some extent you look at what's happening in schools, and you're really beginning to see that there is an impact in terms of the quality of public services, in terms of waiting times, and all those sorts of things. So it's got much more difficult in the last couple of years.
So is now the time to ease up then on austerity?
There is potential scope to ease up on austerity. We could spend an extra few £1 billion a year, but in the end, you know, we have debt still at 90% or nearly 90% of national income. At some point we really need to make a choice, and that is, are we going to have a bigger state? And if we're going to have a bigger state, more spending in total, then at some point we will have to have more tax. Or we're going to decide, well, the state at its current level is about the right size. In that case, we just have to get used to living in a world in which we've got less in the way of public services than we would previously have expected.
In extreme times, however, political expediency often trumps fiscal rules. It's not just backbench MPs arguing for a public sector pay rise, but ministers too. As a result, the austerity agenda may not survive the end of the year, no matter how much it costs. Well, to talk about all that and more, we're joined from central London by the new Justice Secretary, David Lidington. Hello, thank you for coming on the show this morning.
Hi.
Now, I know you were hoping to come in and talk about your shiny new justice brief, but once again, the front pages of the newspapers are all about Theresa May's leadership. According to the Sunday Times and the Mail on Sunday, Andrew Mitchell has said that the PM's got to go, she's got no authority, there's a kamikaze group of Conservative MPs willing to risk another election. Are these plots happening?
I think there's always in July a lot of gossip, you know, hot weather, people going to rather too many summer parties for their own good, and you get this sort of silly story. What I see with the Prime Minister and my cabinet colleagues is a government that's knuckling down to work, that's saying, look, the public have given us the election result, we have to live with that, make adjustments to that. But there's some big problems out there. The impact of digital technology on our economy, how we fund and reform our public services in the future, how we deal with a huge intergenerational issue like social care. And I think the public want the government to be getting on with that. And sort of self-indulgent gossip really doesn't help anybody. We need to get the job done.
It's an admirably loyal answer from you, but you and I both know that these conversations are going on. Has Theresa May lost her authority?
No, I look at the Prime Minister's performance, at Prime Minister's questions and the support she's been getting from the Conservative side of the House. I look at how she's been chairing cabinet meetings every week. I look at how she's taken charge of the ministerial task force on Grenfell. And I see somebody who is very determined to lead and to get on with the job.
Now, I'm keen to talk to you about austerity. We've just shown a film where I went to a school in Hackney to talk about funding changes, to talk about the public sector pay cap. And teachers there were really struggling. They felt underappreciated. They felt like they couldn't do the things that they wanted to do with their lives, like buy a house. Is it time now for that pay cap to end, in your personal opinion?
I think that you've got to look at the issues of pay in the context of public spending overall. It's worth reminding ourselves that so far this government has implemented every one of the recommendations from pay review bodies that have come in this year.
The pay review bodies are effectively instructed on what to do by the government. So that's an easy, excuse for you, isn't it?
No. That's not the case at all. The pay review bodies are independent. They obviously take advice and take evidence from the government, and the government, the Treasury on behalf of the government, puts forward the overall arguments about the need for the country to live within its means. So that's the record so far. Now, clearly, every minister in the government wants to see us putting as much money as we can afford to do into the front line of public services. And you look at our track record, you see the education budget has gone up and is due to rise further. Same is true of health and so on. But we have at the same time to take account of the fact that the country still has a deficit. And as long as we have an annual deficit, that means that the amount we pay, not on public services, but the amount we're paying on interest payments is going up each year. And it also means that there's an accumulated underlying debt that we're passing on to the next generation to carry on their backs and try to repay. So yeah, it's important to look at this in the round. The country's got to live within its means. We need economic policies to get the growth which will allow us to spend more on key public services like schools. And we need to try and make sure that we are fair to the people like teachers, like nurses, doctors, working very hard in the front line of those services.
It's quite a novel experience to hear a government minister sticking to the government line on this. Certainly some of your colleagues didn't appear to get that memo, people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. So if government policy is being made by those people who shout the loudest, this is your chance. What's top of your wish list? What do you want to happen?
I think what's going to happen is that the government will take a collective view on the overall balance in public spending, borrowing, taxation. There's a budget later this year at which the Chancellor will set out the scope for making changes in the year ahead, and we've got 3 outstanding pay review bodies due to report from this year's round, and obviously we will be responding in due course to those.
Let's turn to your justice brief now, shall we, finally, after going through some other issues before. Now, a report this summer said that violence in our prisons is now out of control. The head of the Prison Officers Association says it's a bloodbath. Do you accept that the prison system that you've inherited is in crisis?
I think the prison system has got very severe problems, yes, and I would share the view that my predecessor, Liz Truss, expressed publicly in the white paper of November last year, that at the moment prisons are not working in the way that we want them to do. There's too much violence, too much self-harm, too many drugs getting into prisons, and we're not making enough use of the time we have people in prison to get them educated, get them to take on skills that make them employable when they're released and less likely to commit crimes again. And there's a programme of work that we've got, including targeted spending, to deliver improvements. That starts with 2,500 extra prison officers to ease the pressures on the current hard-working prison officer teams and make sure that they can manage the regimes and the security more effectively in prisons. But it also is the money that we've spent on 300 new sniffer dogs to trace drugs in prisons. It's the new kit that we've got into every prison now to try to detect mobile phones that are being used illegally there. It's the new intelligence unit that we've set up inside the prison service to try to make sure we're dealing with things like organised gangs, and we're getting many, many more organised gang members in prisons now than there were in the past. It's the work we are doing with the police to share intelligence and information on the use of drones, because we're finding that criminal enterprises are using drones to try to take illegal drugs and illegal mobile phones over the prison walls. So on all these fronts, we're moving forward. I'd like to see us move further and faster. I'm determined to get improvements. We start, yes, as you say, by acknowledging that there are some very big challenges that face us, but we have a determination and a plan to get those improvements, and that will make the country safer in the long term, particularly if we can get the education, the training, the work programmes effective in prisons, so that we have people coming out who can get a job and who are less likely to commit crime again.
You talk about those big challenges. It's not been helped, has it, let's be honest, by the fact that the government's cut 7,000 prison officers since coming into power and has only recommitted to rehiring half of them.
When the coalition government came in 2010, we were facing a huge economic crisis and a massive problem with a government deficit of Greek proportions. And tough, immediate decisions had to be taken then that affected the prison service, the Ministry of Justice, along with practically every other department, to try to restrain spending so we could get that deficit down. That has bought us some opportunity now. That discipline over our finances, the tough decisions over public sector pay restraint, the tough decisions about benefit reform, mean that we have the headroom now, having cut the deficit by 3/4, to provide the extra 2,500 prison officers that I've talked about, to commit ourselves to £8 billion of additional spending on the National Health Service during the lifetime of this Parliament. So actually, sound money and living within your means is what frees us then to make improvements in public spending in the front line when the finances are in order.
Now, before you go, I'm keen to talk to you about the really tragic case of Charlie Gard, the little boy who's terminally ill. His parents are locked in a court battle to try and extend his treatment so that they can go to the US and try out experimental therapy. Do you think it's right that judges can overrule the wishes of his parents?
But it is right that judges interpret the law independently and dispassionately. As ministers and as a government, we have no role to play in the Charlie Gard case, as would be the case with any other proceeding in court. What is happening in that case is that Charlie's parents, and goodness knows, any of us, particularly if we have children, must feel desperately for them. His parents are putting their case through their lawyers. The hospital doctors are putting their case, and an independent advocate from the court service, acting as the independent guardian for Charlie, is putting a case to the court. And what all of them are arguing is what is the course of action that is in Charlie's best interests. That is what the argument hinges upon. Frankly, I do not envy the judges who are having to take decisions on this. It must be an incredibly pressured, probably emotional, underneath the judicial professionalism, really emotional, sort of heart-wrenching case for them to have to decide. But they are independent. They know their duty is to decide the case on the basis of what they genuinely consider to be in the best interest of Charlie himself.
OK, David Lidington, thank you for your time today.